Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I actually ran into Ali for the first time when he was out in Vancouver, which is where I'm from. So we're kind of covering both ends of the country. I was at Jennifer's sort of opening of the MasterCard Cybersecurity Center just a few months ago, and it's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. Now, what Ali did promise me was that this was a mixed audience between Canadians and people from outside Canada. Can you get a show of hands of people who are from outside of Canada, please? Excellent. So my presentation is for you guys because the rest of you know everything there is to know. So no, but in all seriousness, I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the supercluster, but with a context in mind, which is where are we already good? Where can we be better? And what are we doing in terms of investments that can make us great? So I'll start with a little bit of a commercial for all my colleagues from the government of Canada. Thank you. The Supercluster program was born about 4.5 years ago. And it was an attempt to really galvanize and catalyze the strengths of some of the ecosystems across the country, to build for stronger research and development capabilities to commercialize some of the technologies that are just around the corner, and to build market-leading advantages in key sectors of the economy that we think will shape the 21st century. So it was a competitive process, and we were among 5 that were selected ultimately. You can see the 5 on the chart here. But we're the technology supercluster, and we all have a national mandate. So although we begin regionally, and it takes a little bit of time, believe it or not, to kind of get from one end of the country to the other. But we are making our progress across the country in order to do that. We have colleagues in Saskatchewan that are leading the protein supercluster. There's one in Ontario around advanced manufacturing. There's one in Quebec on supply chain AI, and of course the one that's locally here, the ocean supercluster. For us, our supercluster is really focused on a few things. It's really about the transformation of companies in the digital domain, and in particular, harnessing the power of data in affecting sort of that productivity competitiveness challenge that we see across industries. But our particular focus is really around health, natural resources, the transformation of industry, and ultimately around digital skilling that is needed for the new economy. This is the commercial for all you folks that are from outside Canada. I'm just going to speak a little bit about where Canada's standing is right now from a digital context. One is we rank very high in terms of sort of the international recognition of digitized countries, and certainly Canada ranks right there near the top. But there's a few things that I just want to highlight. One is there's a few areas where we are really leading, and it's been more than a decade in the making. One is in the area of open data. So for probably about the last 15 to 20 years, Canada's made a progressive sort of investment at all levels of government around how we can look at data from an open perspective first. The second is that we've had a long-standing view from many of our peers around the world that we're a country with strong governance, a strong sort of responsibility. And so our trust index is very high. So we rank very high on that. And of course, of late has been sort of the developments around artificial intelligence and next generation technologies. And again, we rank quite high. So if you see the intersection of some of these things, if you have great governance and trust, you've got open data, and data is going to be a big asset pool for the next gen of the things that we're going to do. If you can stitch that together with this responsibility that we need and ethics in AI, then we can have a real leadership position around that. And that's sort of the counterbalance to everything that we're talking about here. There's both fear and there's opportunity. And I want to talk more about the opportunity today. So in AI, I think we're quite pleased to see that 3 of Canada cities rank among the top in terms of AI expertise. And certainly what I hear is here in New Brunswick, lots going on there, possibly a center of excellence for AI. And we see this across the country. So there's a lot of resonance in terms of what's happening. For us, AI isn't just what we do, but it's just a component of many of the different areas that we're investing in. So we invest in projects that are advancing technologies from a wide array of different digital types, including cybersecurity, including genomics, in the area of sensing and IoT, in the areas of quantum computing, in the areas of blockchain technologies. And I'm going to go through a couple of examples towards the end. I think these are all hallmarks of where we're going. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our approach and how we operationalize this. And this is quite consistent with, this mandate that we have of trying to build for stronger collaborations in research and development in the country. So first of all, the model is quite different than most investment or funding programs that the government has offered in the past. This is really a demand-oriented program. In other words, the very first starting point is that we look at customer problem sets, challenges that they might look at, and look at where they would invest. And so it starts with sort of the demand side to identify that. The second part is that we, along with a consortium of other partners, co-invest in that project. So there's an element of shared risk, there's an element of shared investment, and of course, ultimately to accelerate the outcomes of what we're co-investing in. And finally, on the last part is really, it's sort of this view that says always in mind the adoption and how we can drive this initial sort of product set innovations into the mainstream marketplace. So very much an orientation on market, and it's a balance of the supply and the demand side of what's required in digital technologies. We've had some good success. We've actually invested in more than 80 projects now, initially very small projects, of late more projects that are probably in the range of $20 to $25 million in size. In total, a portfolio of about $400 million in projects that we've done. And one of the important things here is, as we've seen in the Canadian landscape, it really is about supporting the interest and scale up of SMEs. And so we're quite pleased to see lots of them are getting involved with our undertakings and our projects. And, you can see some of the stats and figures here, but really important to us is this co-investment idea is really generating new products. So we're currently working on about 150 new product and innovations that are going into the marketplace with built-in customers as part of that whole equation. And then ultimately, that's about scaling that not domestically only, but also looking at international markets for where that can be. And that's really kind of opened up the laneways for a lot of new collaborations that we see happening as we look to grow the export markets. There's lots of new IP that's being generated, most of which we're trying to encourage the companies to look for ways that they can actually work with one another to share and cross-share some of that. And that builds additional capacity inside of what we're doing to kind of lever up what our investments have been to date. So what I want to speak about now are one of some of the project areas that specifically around trust that we've seen some great progress towards, and this will illuminate the kinds of areas that some of our members and project teams are exploring and developing right now. So the first one I'm going to talk about is healthcare. And for those of you who are from the healthcare sector, I'm sure that I'll see a lot of nodding of heads on this. And for those of you who participate in the healthcare system, which is all of us, you're probably going to note a few things. So the first thing is the fundamental problem of trust in healthcare. And there's a lot of bullets in this slide, but I'll kind of say it this way. We have a network of health systems across the country, which are all a little bit different. There are still lots of instances of paper-based systems. There are a lot of instances of information silos. A lot of instances of the lack of sharing across these different silos of key information. And then, of course, nowadays, with the advances that we've seen in the healthcare delivery model and the types of patient care that you can get, the complexity of the patient journey can be quite pronounced. So you can see yourself telling the same story to multiple care providers over and over again. So that's an example of where there are some fundamental issues in trust in the healthcare system. So here's an example. So if you kind of take a look at the foundational pieces of trust in healthcare, it starts with, well, there's a lot of information. It sits in silos. There is no fundamental infrastructure that allows these silos to interconnect. There's not a mechanism to define who should or should not get access to that on a universal basis. And as a consequence, if you are, let's say that you are the mother of a child who has a pediatric medical condition, and you just imagine the care protocol that you would have to undergo to visit physicians, to take notes, you carry around a binder essentially. You show that binder to every physician you see. And it's not just about whether or not you have your medical records electronically on your phone. It's actually about what's being provided to you in the form of sort of the care protocols. It's all of the nuances associated with interpreting test results, and it's what it is that you need to do as a result of it. It's not just your prescriptions. So you can imagine that for anyone who's trying to navigate the system right now, it's very cumbersome. So one project that is attempting to try to solve for this is a project that is called Trustphere, and it's led by a consortium, which is really trying to put the patient at the center of all of this. And the idea is it's aiming to empower Canadians with a kind of a trust-based health platform. And the idea is to allow them to view, share, and manage and act upon their own health data across a spectrum of different care providers, stakeholders, and whatnot. And I'll just describe roughly what it looks like. So in this particular case, they chose a use case that was about pediatric diabetes type 1. And as you can imagine, you know, the parents of patients like this are very vested in ensuring that not only do they have access to all the information, but all those that would seek to be part of the care plan would as well. So the patient at the center essentially has sort of all of the data that's tied to it, but has the mechanisms through this network to kind of determine where it can be shared, who can have access to it, and all of the various caregivers actually contribute towards a care plan. And that is sort of a universal part of this equation for them. And then ultimately, on the research side of it, should the patient and their parents obviously elect to, they can provide that health data to researchers as part of a broader research pool. So this is one example of a project. I'm going to talk about another one. There's another trust problem that is just really founded on this data sharing notion. And there's a few things I just want to talk about. This is in the context of sort of rare diseases. And one of the big issues is to solve rare and complex diseases, you need a lot of data. No single institution has enough of this data to hit the inflection point of discoveries of their own. Data remains under the physical administrative control of data stewards. And so I think the conclusion is, well, what if you change the paradigm? And we're not so interested in creating these data lakes where you actually need to move data, but that you move to a new model, and you move to a model which was more about federated learning as opposed to federated data. And so let me just describe what that looks like. So there's a project that is led by a company in Toronto called DNA Stack. There's a project called the Autism Sharing Initiative, very similar to the previous case in that, you know, autism is one of those conditions that, particularly for younger people, is an area that parents have a vested interest in dealing with. So in this particular one, it's about building the first federated and fully protected global network for sharing genomics and biomedical data to accelerate research and develop precision healthcare approaches for individuals with autism. So how does it actually work? So the idea of federated learning is to derive insights without moving the actual data. So here's the example is, you know, on the left, you'll see that's where the data resides, but ultimately what you want to do is you want to push the learning algorithms into the data rather than pulling the data in order to run your algorithms. So in a federated case, it kind of has a few steps on this. You know, the first of all, the first step is the user chooses which statistical models that they want to train. The second step is, you know, you'll kind of push down this untrained models into the data. It'll come back. You'll kind of make your iterations. Then you have trained models, and then you can actually then, when you've got trained models, push it back into the system so you can attribute those learnings into the data. So that's two examples. And then the third one, I want to move off healthcare because it's not the only area where you can actually tackle fundamental trust issues. With all of us, we're kind of looking at, well, the sustainability agenda. And in particular, what is it that we're going to do in this next iteration, which is not just about climate, but also about how we consume everyday goods. And increasingly, the environmental sustainability and governance agenda, the ESG agenda, is front and center for not only consumers, but increasingly investors and stakeholders. So the question of trust comes into the following regime, which is sort of how do you overcome greenwashing and how do you ensure that the things that you are purchasing or consuming or the things that you're investing in terms of companies actually have the attributes that are verifiable. And you can imagine that this is a trust problem, not for a single organization, but across organizations, especially with the complexities of supply chains and the linkages between different organizations in that regard. So on the left side, you'll see, stakeholders like investors and others who are interested in making sure that your company has an ESG sort of prerogative, and that you're actually going to fulfill that and proving that you're doing that. Secondly is on the consumer side, they're going to look for verifiability of the goods and products that they're purchasing, that they're actually genuinely certified to the degree that you're making claims on. And then finally, I think this is just an intermix of saying, this complexity of supply chains kind of drives this ESG agenda. So I'm going to talk about a project which doesn't actually tie to our supercluster today, but I think in the future will. It is something that our government of BC is actually pushing forward, which is called the Mining Digital Trust Ecosystem. And as the name suggests, one of the fundamental drivers for sort of the clean agenda is to ensure that we have sustainability in the raw materials and almost, let's say, the critical minerals that are necessary for all things that we're going to create, whether it's electrification, including the materials that go into solar panels, or the kinds of things that we need to kind of make more sustainable goods. So knowing that in British Columbia and many parts of the country, we are working on an agenda that has the correct balance between the ingredients that we need for a clean economy and also ensuring that they're done in a very sustainable and responsible way. So how do we do that? The digital mining, the mining digital trust ecosystem is really about that idea of sustainability. It uses the BC government long had invested in OrgBook, which is sort of a digital repository of all of the businesses, and it also provides a lot of the information bases for how companies need to kind of remain within sort of the regulatory frameworks of all things, but it is sort of the central repository. And so the idea is to use this concept that has been more notable of late as verifiable credentials. So for those of you who are really deeply into the blockchain experience set, this is one method by which you can actually provide the verifiability of the particular thing or good or a transaction, is using that sort of decentralized ledger system. So the example workflow is you're going to have multiple mining companies at this. And ultimately, the credentials that they exchange between the mining companies and the government will sort of build up the repository of known verifiable credentials. And so if you're looking at permitting or specific attributes of mining sites or how they're being run, then essentially that will all be contained through these exchanges between the mining organizations and the government. But equally important are the other stakeholders which would seek to have access to that information, which is sort of the third party element to this. And so ultimately, if you build an ecosystem that is founded on the notion that it's not just a bilateral relationship, it's going to be a multilateral relationship where the information you exchange is ultimately going to be consumable by third parties. And you can see the chain moving along beyond just the mining portion, but into the production side. And you can do this not just for mining, you can do this for agriculture and how we grow food. You can do it for just about anything that we're looking for to be able to verify in the future. So there are some examples of where Canada has an opportunity to invest in research and development projects that advance the cause of our digital trust platforms, and also at the same time kind of builds for sustainability and real innovation in some of the key sectors of the economy. And with that, I want to thank you very much for your time, and happy to take questions. I know that was a lot for a late afternoon presentation. Okay, I think we can finish early. Thank you very much.